Now let's continue to reflect on the South African Reserve Bank's decision to increase interest rates by 50 basis points yesterday. There have been various voices that have weighed in on this particular decision, but the SARB was unanimous in its decision yesterday. Joining me now is Absa economist Miyelani Maluleke to unpack this further. A very good afternoon to you, Miyelani, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I want to start with your thoughts on the fact that the SARB chose to go with a 50 basis points increase as opposed to what many were hoping would be 25 basis points.
Yeah, so analyst consensus was for a 25 basis point hike, but we were actually calling for 50 basis points. So we were not surprised by the decision that the Reserve Bank has made. I think they've been very clear, especially in the first two MPC meetings of this year, that they're very concerned about upside risks to the inflation outlook. And I think they also stated quite specifically that they are seeing the rand as one of those big upside risks to the inflation outlook. So when we did have very sharp rand depreciation over the last 3 weeks, for us, that was a clear materialization of a big risk that the SARB had been cautioning about, and we did believe that they were going to respond strongly. And so I think the 50 basis point hike for us was not a surprise.
Miyelani, would it not be possible to factor these risks into a discussion amongst the Monetary Policy Committee, because things like load shedding are here to stay for an indefinite amount of time, and rather focus on shocks that might come from geopolitical developments, for example, or any other things, because it would seem if we're focusing on these upside risks, as you've just decided, then it looks like it's going to be a bleak time for many in South Africa for a long time.
Well, that's a really good point. I think the SARB does that, right? And I think they're always very clear in these MPC statements that the policy stance that they set at any given point in time reflects the information and the balance of risks that they have at that particular point in time, right? And I think if you were in March, for instance, there is just no way that you could have anticipated that the rand would depreciate in the manner that it did, posing the risk to the inflation outlook in the manner that it does right now. And the truth is that that information has changed since March, and the SARB MPC has to take these new developments into account, as well as the balance of risks around that. I think it is what they do. But I think the key thing that one also wants to underline here is that inflation is bad. Inflation erodes the disposable incomes of South Africans, particularly lower income South Africans who don't have any means of protecting themselves from high inflation. And I think it is from that perspective that the SARB is saying, it does what it needs to do to make sure that inflation does not become embedded at higher levels for a protracted period, because that would be quite damaging for the economy over the long run.
Yeah, and what is this long run, Miyelani? Because the governor did indicate yesterday that they've just entered their restrictive territory. So we're going to be seeing a little bit more pressure for, he said, the medium to the long term. But what does that medium to long term look like?
Yeah, so of course, the key thing is, where do we see inflation going, right? How far away is inflation from where the South African Reserve Bank wants to see inflation, which we must remember is the midpoint of the target range, which is about 4.5%. So we're now in a space that the SARB is characterizing as restrictive. Of course, interest rates have gone up by 475 basis points since November 2021. But for some time, the SARB has been saying policy is not restrictive, it's just less accommodative. But we've now moved into a space where policy is now seen as restrictive. Perhaps that's a signal that the SARB is saying, we may be getting into a space where we're happy to pause a little bit, see what the tightening that we've done so far delivers in terms of easing that inflation. I think the good thing is that when you look at the SARB's own forecast, it does show inflation easing, going down, and we believe that's a good thing. And from where we're sitting, we actually think that the SARB may not have to increase interest rates further. We think they're likely to remain on hold at this point. But we should be clear here that the environment is still very uncertain. And if the balance of risks shift, we get further rand weakness, or we get inflation data that suggests that inflation is not going to come down in the way that the SARB expects it to, it's possible that we may see further action from the MPC.
In the immediate term, Miyelani, as a final thought from you, what are the immediate shocks that businesses face from that increase? The cost of borrowing may become a little bit more affordable for them, and so operations could be impacted by any chance. Perhaps just paint a picture of those immediate implications that those operating on the ground may feel from this hawkish stance that the SARB has remained on.
Yeah, so I mean, you're absolutely correct. I think the most immediate channel, of course, of high interest rates is that borrowing costs are going to go up for many businesses, but also for consumers, right? Which means that demand conditions also in the near term could soften as people have to see more of their real disposable income channeled towards servicing their debt commitments. I think that's going to be the effect in the near term. But I think, as Governor Kganyago stressed yesterday, we are going to feel some pain in the short term because of these higher debt service costs. But it's really in the hope that this is necessary to ensure that inflation does not be embedded over the longer run, because that would be far more damaging to the economy and to households and businesses, rather than having these higher interest rates in the near term.
Thank you very much for those insights, Miyelani. As always, Miyelani Maluleke joining us this afternoon to speak about the interest rate decision and the short and long-term implications of the SARB's decision. With that, here's